I'm very delighted to introduce Ann Kibbie to you tonight. She will be talking about, her title will be On the Brink of the Grave, Early Stories of Blood Transfusion. And when I knew about the kind of work she was doing, and she and I serve on the Maine Humanities Council, on the board of the Maine Humanities Council, I said, you've got to speak at the UNE. UNE seems to be a natural place for Professor Kibbie. And she very kindly accepted. So a brief bio. Anne Louise Kibbie is assistant professor of English at Bowdoin College, specializing in the literature of the long 18th century. She received a BA from Boston University and a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Her publications include essays on Daniel Defoe's Moll Flanders and Roxana, Samuel Richardson's Pamela and Clarissa, and 18th century narratives, tales told by things. Her current book project, entitled On the Brink of the Grave, Transfusion in Literature and Medicine, 1666-1897, is a medical, literary, and cultural history of the development of blood transfusion in Great Britain. Please help me in welcoming Professor Kibbie.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight. And I'd like to thank Dr. Majid and the Center for Global Humanities for inviting me to speak to you this evening. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here at UNE. And I'd like to say a special hello to Catherine Olmsted and the group at the Holton Public Library who are joining us tonight. It's great to have you here with us. This talk focuses on my current book project, which, as Dr. Majid said, is a medical, literary, and cultural history of the first modern phase in the development of something that we now take for granted in medical practice, blood transfusion. This project takes me from the final decades of the 17th century, just after the restoration of the British monarchy in 1660, and about the same time that the English were renaming New Amsterdam, New York, to 1897, the year of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. That means it's the 60th year of her reign. 1897 also saw the publication of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. This project follows two main currents. One is the dramatic story of the development of blood transfusion as a viable medical practice. The other is the emergence of transfusion over the same period of time as an important metaphor, image, or plot device in a wide range of satirical, sentimental, sensational, and Gothic literary texts. But to speak as I do of the medical and the literary history of transfusion as two currents, rather than as two threads or two roads, for example, is to emphasize the fluidity of the boundaries between them. In this talk, I would like to give you a sense of how these two currents come together. Now, this project started for me out of simple curiosity. I was preparing to teach Bram Stoker's Dracula in a course on the Gothic novel. And I had read Stoker's novel many times before, the hair standing up on the back of my neck as the vampire count scuttled up and down castle walls or had his coffins of earth delivered to a vacant abbey in England. But this time around, I was especially struck by its medical rather than its supernatural content. And these are the episodes that I selected as part of the readings for tonight, the transfusion episodes. As Count Dracula's lovely victim Lucy Westenra wastes away, her rejected suitor, Dr. John Seward, summons his brilliant teacher, Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, to help with her baffling case. And it's worth noting that this part of Dracula is an extended case history of a puzzling medical condition. On Van Helsing's first visit to his new patient, he and Seward enter Lucy's bedchamber to find her, in Seward's words, ghastly, chalkily pale. The red seemed to have gone even from her lips and gums, and the bones of her face stood out prominently. Her breathing was painful to see or hear. Van Helsing cries, "There's no time to be lost. There must be a transfusion of blood at once." Using the patient's fiancé as the blood donor, Van Helsing quickly performs the transfusion, and Seward describes the miraculous results. As the transfusion went on, something like life seemed to come back to Lucy's cheeks. On the following day, when the physicians visit her again, they're relieved to find Lucy looking a different being from what she had been before the operation, as they say, full of a happy vivacity. The cure is short-lived, however, and Van Helsing will perform 3 more emergency transfusions on Lucy, using a different blood donor each time. Eventually, medical intervention proves to be no match for the Count's supernatural power, and Lucy joins the ranks of the undead. But what I wanted to know this time around reading Dracula was whether or not Bram Stoker's fictional scenes had any foundation in 19th century medical practice. Did 19th century physicians, in fact, perform such operations? The short answer to that question turned out to be yes. But that answer was, for me, only the beginning. The milestones in the medical history of transfusion are clear, and I'll be referring to some of the major ones here. But as a person who spends her life reading literary texts, I became absorbed in something else. I became fascinated by the overall 19th century discourse of transfusion. Over the course of the 19th century, medical journals published dozens of first-hand accounts of transfusion experiments and detailed case histories, reported on live demonstrations of the operation staged for medical practitioners and students, reprinted lectures delivered on the topic in London's famous teaching hospitals, summarized the debates about the operation's efficacy that were held at meetings of various medical societies, and expressed their own editorial opinions regarding transfusion's usefulness and safety. In addition, all of the important 19th century medical encyclopedias in Great Britain and all of the major textbooks on the practice of midwifery or obstetric medicine included substantial discussions of the operation. Finally, 3 monographs on the subject appeared between 1875 and 1883. This wealth of primary materials allows us rare insight into a particular moment in medical history. It allows us to witness the impact of the introduction of a revolutionary and controversial surgical technique on the medical community and on its patients. First, let me give you a quick overview of the history of the medical practice of transfusion. The development of this practice in the Western world begins during what is called the scientific revolution of the late 17th century. Experiments in England and continental Europe, inspired by William Harvey's discoveries concerning the circulation of the blood, progressed rapidly from transfusions of blood between animals of the same species to transfusions of blood between animals of different species to transfusions of blood from animals, most commonly calves and lambs, to men. The early transfusionists were not primarily interested in the operation as a remedy for loss of blood. Rather, they saw it as a promising treatment for chronic or acute mental and physical diseases that they believed originated in the blood itself. Perhaps some even speculated transfusion would also prove to be the key to rejuvenation or to immortality. This first stage in transfusion's history came to an end in 1670, however, when the widely publicized death of a Frenchman after a series of transfusions of calf's blood led the French government to ban all such experiments, and other countries followed suit shortly hereafter. It's important to note that this particular death was not, in fact, caused by the transfusions. The victim's wife had poisoned him with arsenic. Nevertheless, the scandal galvanized opposition to the operation. England's own unofficial moratorium on blood transfusion would last almost 150 years. Interest in transfusion did not, of course, entirely disappear during this hiatus. Throughout the 18th century, surgical treatises written for a medical or scientific audience included detailed instructions for performing the operation, even as they warned their readers against it. As just one example, in his General System of Surgery, which was printed in Great Britain at least 9 times from 1743 to 1768, the great German surgeon Lorenz Heister cautions that, quote, almost all the patients who have been this way treated have degenerated into a stupidity, a foolishness, or a raving or melancholy madness, or else have been taken off with a sudden death, either in or not long after the operations, unquote. Nevertheless, despite this hyperbolic and wildly inaccurate warning, Heister provides a technically complete description of the operation, accompanied by detailed illustrations. And here is an illustration from his. So there. You can do it yourself. References on blood transfusion are not limited to those works like Heister's, aimed at what we would now call a professional readership. They appear in a wide range of texts, such in books of medical advice for the layperson, in biographies of the members of the Royal Society, and in the newly founded Encyclopedia Britannica. Even the author of A Tourist's Guidebook to London, in describing the portraits of the medical luminaries hanging in the Royal College of Surgeons, might pause to recount to his readers the experiments of the late 17th century and to muse, quote, "Would that transfusion could be extended to the human species, and should the change be effected on mind as well as body, how unspeakable would be the benefit to the whole race. Not only every loathsome disorder would be done away with, but every folly, meanness, and vice changed to their opposite virtues by a due transfusion of worthy plebeian blood. And what would make the experiment more beautiful, not the least inconvenience in body or mind would result to the generous lender of the uncontaminated fluid," unquote. This passage is a fascinating amalgamation of semi-magical thinking about blood itself, the belief that a change in our blood would effect a change in our characters or morals, and a more modern vision of blood donation. It even raises the question of social class, as it imagines both the value and the limitless supply of plebeian blood. The actual practice of transfusion in Great Britain resumes in 1818, when James Blundell, lecturer on physiology and midwifery at Guy's Hospital in London, read a report before the Medico-Chirurgical Society describing a series of blood transfusions that he had himself performed on dogs, and urging that this useful surgery be made available to humans. Blundell's work departed from his 17th century predecessors in a number of significant ways. First, you'll be happy to know, he rejected interspecies transfusion. And I'd be glad to say more about animal-to-human transfusion in the question-answer session if you'd like. Second, unlike the 17th century experimenters who had seen in the operation a potential cure for a multitude of mental and physical illnesses, Blundell focused on transfusion as the treatment for a specific medical crisis, one with which, as an obstetrician, he was all too familiar: life-threatening hemorrhage. Uterine hemorrhage was a much more common feature of childbirth in the 19th century. It was the obstetrician's greatest fear and the greatest challenge to his skill. In a series of lectures to his medical students, Blundell described how the experience of watching helplessly as his patients bled to death motivated his groundbreaking work. And here's Blundell himself. "I have seen a woman dying for 2 or 3 hours together, convinced in my own mind that no known remedy could save her. The sight of these moving cases first led me to transfusion." Over and over again, Blundell invokes the spectacle of the female patient helplessly gripped in death's clutches. And here are his words again. "She is pale and ghastly and cold and gasping. Her heart flutters. There is little or no pulse in the wrist. She lives still, but the grave yawns under her, eager for its prey. Over the victim, death shakes his dart, and to you she stretches out her helpless hands for that assistance which you cannot give, unless by transfusion." In another dramatic passage, he describes the tragic end in store for this pathetic victim if transfusion is unavailable. "She sinks to rise and sink again, like the flashes of the half-extinguished taper, while with a reluctance which avails her nothing, she is gradually subsiding lower, 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 till at length she suddenly drops into that grave from which, under the use of received remedies, no human art can save her," unquote. Now, as you can imagine, Blundell's eloquence was renowned, and his rhetoric here belongs in the category of what we call the sentimental. That is, Blundell confronts his listeners or readers with the pathetic, almost unbearable spectacle of a helpless victim. That this victim is female is a fact that in and of itself heightens the sentimental effect here. And he uses both a detailed description of intense bodily torment and a highly theatrical, we might say melodramatic language in order to evoke his listeners' sympathy for the suffering subject and to promote his cause. Paradoxically, It is this very sentimentalization of the patient that justifies her transformation into the subject of what is, after all, experimental surgery. The advocates of transfusion acknowledge that the operation is a controversial one, and to counter resistance, they place a special stress on the pathos of obstetric trauma and on the painful burden that such a potential domestic tragedy places on the practitioner himself. As Robert Barnes, Dean of St. Thomas's Medical School, remarks tersely in an essay on transfusion published in 1874, there is nothing more sad than to see a woman in labor or childbirth bleed to death. The transfusionists refer to their obstetric patients as, quote, the most interesting part of the creation, unquote. They remind their readers that each of these patients represents, quote, some life of more than ordinary moment, unquote. In the new life-saving role that transfusion offers the practitioner, doubt is its own punishment. As one proponent of the operation writes in 1826, if there lives a skeptic to the powers of transfusion, he cannot receive a more just reward than in being ever shut out by his prejudices from the enjoyment of that satisfaction which results from so closely contributing and restoring a wife to her husband and a mother to her children, unquote. The reintroduction of blood transfusion into actual medical practice is, therefore, inseparable from the increasing emphasis in the 19th century on the woman as medical subject. And in some respects, it conforms to the gendered scene of Victorian medicine that has been the subject of much feminist scholarship over the past several decades. In this now standard reading of the enactment of medical authority and power, the masculine figure of scientific and/or medical expertise exerts his sometimes violent authority over the body of the woman, a body that through disease or trauma or through the inevitable pathology that femininity itself represents in the Victorian world has been identified as in need of his professional intervention. However, this is too simple an account for the complex innovation that transfusion represents. Transfusion brings into being an entirely new actor in the medical scene, one who significantly transforms the medical drama by triangulating the relationship between doctor and patient, and one who introduces entirely new anxieties about the place of the non-professional in the medical scene. This is the figure of the live human donor. For the first time in medical history, a healthy human being will undergo a surgical intervention, and one that is not entirely without discomfort or risk, in order to aid in another person's medical treatment. The 19th century practice of transfusion thus creates the first fully fledged example of what Catherine Waldby and Robert Mitchell, in their discussion of organ donation, will call a tissue economy. That is, in their words, a model of the body and of relationships between bodies in which one can share its vitality with another through the redistribution of tissues from donor to recipient through biotechnical intervention. Such an economy necessitates and itself accomplishes a crucial act of revaluation of a substance that has hitherto existed outside of the realm of exchange. Thus, transfusion converts what has been nothing but a worthless byproduct of surgery in the past, blood that was in earlier operations simply defined as medical waste, into a valuable substance for another's use. Or we might say, to use a word that alludes more explicitly both to the idea of exchange and to the specter of vampirism that haunts transfusion in the 19th century, it transforms it into a valuable substance for another's consumption. Transfusion allows us to witness for the first time in medical history a bodily product in the very process of migrating from the category of pure waste to the category of a substance whose reuse creates an almost incalculable value. Now, let me back up just a bit. I've said that before the operation of transfusion, the blood that medical practitioners removed from bodies was simply treated as medical waste. I'd like to say more about this earlier phase of medical history by turning to a brief discussion of the surgical intervention that had, until well into the 19th century, been considered an indispensable, if not the primary tool of the physician's art: bloodletting, also known as venesection or phlebotomy. Over the course of the 19th century, both medical and popular texts will describe a paradigmatic shift in medical theory and practice, as the medical community slowly abandoned its belief in and dependence on this earlier form of what was called heroic medicine. But as we shall see, the fate of the venerable operation of bloodletting, which became the symbol of medical science's past ignorance, becomes intertwined with transfusion's own developing story. You can't have one without the other. In January of 1865, the London Review of Politics, Society, Literature, Art, and Science published an article with the intriguingly Gothic title, Vampires. We think, here comes Dracula. The reader, expecting a foray into the supernatural, would be disappointed by its contents, however. The vampires we meet in the article's opening paragraph are not the undead rising from their graves to suck the blood of the living. Instead, they're medical practitioners. The writer begins by alluding to a day, the time, he says, of our great-great-grandmothers, when, quote, a man could scarcely set about any transaction in life without being, as a preliminary measure, bled. He would be let blood before he went on a journey, and he would be let blood when he came back. Bloodletting was the grand specific for all diseases. If a man broke his leg, you bled him. If he fainted, you had the bandage around his arm in a trice. Now, this writer goes on to contrast this past mania, that's what he calls it, mania for bleeding and for being bled, with the present day in which, quote, phlebotomy seems to have gone all but entirely out of fashion, unquote. And now I'm going to turn to his words again. That abominable little lancet with the tortoiseshell handle, he notes, and the lancet is a specific tool developed for penetrating the vein for bloodletting. So that abominable little lancet with the tortoiseshell handle is very rarely brought into requisition. Now, the light tone here should not obscure the essential truth of this writer's observations regarding bloodletting's former pervasiveness and its surprising decline. If the author exaggerates anything in this article, it's the length of time that bloodletting has been abandoned. What the editorial represents as a practice buried in the distant past, the time of his readers' great-great-grandmothers, was in fact at its height a mere 30 years earlier. In an essay titled On the History of Bleeding and Its Disuse in Modern Practice, which was published in the British Medical Journal in 1875, W. Mitchell Clark, who was the consulting surgeon to the Bristol General Hospital, addresses with similar astonishment, quote, this abandonment of the old heroic plans. And he goes on to say, we are not likely to see so great a transformation again. Whether we consider the antiquity and duration of the practice of bloodletting and the universality of its employment, or the completeness of its abandonment now, it is equally astounding, nothing less than a complete revolution in the practice of medicine, unquote. Clark attributes the backlash against bloodletting to the excesses of past doctors. A glance at a work devoted to the subject at the height of its popularity earlier in the century provides chilling evidence of such excess. Marshall Hall, an important experimental scientist as well as renowned physician, devotes the first half of his 1830 monograph, Researches Relative to the Morbid and Curative Effects of Loss of Blood, to detailing the morbid effects of blood loss induced by excessive phlebotomy. So these are the symptoms: syncope, fainting, convulsion, delirium, coma, and sudden death. Hall's examples are drawn from his own experience as a physician and from cases published in medical journals such as The Lancet, or communicated to him privately and sometimes anonymously by his colleagues. I'll allow just one case to represent all of those that Hall has assembled in his work. The patient, a woman suffering from headache after labor, quote, dreaded the idea of being bled and said it would certainly kill her, unquote. She is bled nonetheless and appears to recover, quote. It was thought proper, however, to abstract more blood. 4 teacupfuls were taken. These measurements are always a little imprecise. Before teacupfuls were taken, the most dreadful fainting followed, with gasping, open mouth, a convulsive action of the diaphragm, and in an hour or two, death closed the scene, unquote. Now, despite the tragedies that the first half of Hall's work catalogues, it was not his intention, nor was it the immediate effect of his treatise, to put an end to bloodletting. In fact, he himself remained convinced of the efficacy of the practice. Hall's treatise is fascinating not just for the insight it provides into 19th century medical practice itself, but for its own enactment of the conflict between a venerable medical tradition on one hand and modern science on the other. It is a conflict entirely absent from a treatise, the title of which is On Bloodletting, published 5 years later in 1835 by James Wardrop, in which the eminent London surgeon chastises his fellow medical professionals for what he sees as undue caution. This is Wardrop speaking to his colleagues. In almost all cases where bleeding is employed, there is a disposition on the part both of the patient and bystanders, and often, too, of the medical attendant, to be as sparing as possible in the evacuation of blood, whereas in the generality of cases, an effort, I am convinced, should be made rather to take away as much as the patient can bear, unquote. Now, because of the timidity of doctor and patient alike, bloodletting is, Wardrop fears, too tardily resorted to and too sparingly used. And scoffing at the excuse that some patients are, in fact, difficult to bleed, he insists with a zeal that we might be tempted to call vampiric that, quote, any requisite quantity of blood can, by some means or other, be taken from any patient. Should the veins in the arm be inadequate for this purpose, then may the jugular veins or the veins of the wrist be resorted to. Or in cases of danger, why should not an artery be opened? The most severe operations are daily performed in order to save human life, and surely a fellow creature should not be allowed to die for want of losing a quantity of blood, unquote. Hall himself remarks, it sometimes requires no little boldness to abstain from the use of the lancet. Indeed, it would be impossible to overstate the identification of the physician himself with this instrument of his profession. If bloodletting had been the medical practitioner's most powerful mode of treatment, the lancet had become the most common symbol of the physician's power. Even as he chronicles the obsolescence of bloodletting, Clark suspects that his colleagues, like retired gunslingers wistfully eyeing the weapons of their glory days, retain a nostalgic attachment to the tools they have abandoned. Clark writes, we are most decidedly living in one of the periods when the lancet is carried idly in its silver case. No one bleeds. And yet, from the way in which I find that my friends retain their lancets and keep them from rusting, I cannot help thinking that they look forward to a time when they will employ them again, unquote. As Clark's emphasis on the allure of the lancet itself indicates, the surgeon's tool here is also a kind of fetish object. In the past, surgeons had performed phlebotomy on patients as the medically approved treatment for illness or injury. But now, with the advent of transfusion, these same surgeons, despite having lost faith in the therapeutic value of bloodletting, must persuade healthy people to submit to a potentially painful and risky intervention solely for the benefit of another, and in the absence of any therapeutic benefit for the person undergoing phlebotomy. Because transfusion is dependent on phlebotomy, the new surgical operation is likewise vulnerable to its own revaluation of blood and to the new attitude toward bleeding. In this changed therapeutic climate, Charles Jennings, Fellow of the Obstetrical Society of London, in a monograph on transfusion published in 1883, notes, there are many who regard venesection and transfusion as operations dangerous per se. Though I myself do not attach undue importance to these objections, he adds, he does acknowledge the seriousness of performing a new surgery in which the risk involves not only the recipient, but also the giver, and that, he emphasizes, a healthy life. Although throughout the 1870s, the proponents of transfusion emphasize that bloodletting has been a routine part of medical treatment and is completely harmless, their very defensiveness suggests that the shift in public attitude toward bloodletting is having some impact on attitudes toward transfusion as well. Now, Mary Elizabeth Braddon's short story, Good Lady Duquesne, which some of you may have read, exploits the sensational potential of the alliance between the exploded heroic treatment of bloodletting and the newfangled operation of transfusion. Together, these interventions create what I would call a surgical vampire. When we first meet the heroine of Braddon's tale, Bella Rolleston, she is, quote, fresh, blooming, a living image of youth and hope, unquote. But after some months in the service of the grotesquely superannuated Lady Duquesne, she begins to fade. Bella's decline coincides with the appearance of puzzling, angry marks on her round white arms, wounds which Lady Duquesne's personal physician, the sinister Dr. Paravicini, assures Bella are only the bites of the Italian mosquitoes. The pest, he claims, has caught you on the top of a vein. What a vampire! Fortunately, Bella has attracted the professional and romantic interest of Herbert Stafford, a young man who has received the most up-to-date medical education in Edinburgh and Paris and has just finished a 2-year hospital residency. While for the reader, Bella's symptoms and her employer's extraordinary, even grotesque longevity all point too obviously to the conventions of the Gothic tale of vampirism, Stafford interprets her case very differently. In the one genuinely chilling moment of the story, examining her arms in the broad sunlight, Stafford finds them covered with, quote, scars new and old, unquote. These he immediately recognizes as the marks of a lancet. This is no mosquito bite, he exclaims. It is not a bite at all. You're trifling with me. Miss Rolleston, you have allowed that wretched Italian quack to bleed you. As Stafford's aggrieved tone indicates, there's more at stake in this scene than diagnosis. Discredited, detached from any legitimate medical context, the scene of bloodletting that he imagines here can only be a private, illicit, and perhaps erotic transaction. In this story of transfusion, Bella's blood is being stolen from her. But I would like to consider in more detail one of transfusion's most important alterations in medical science, its creation of the idea of the donation of one's own bodily resources, its creation of an entirely new participant in the surgical scene, the live human donor. Because the early transfusionists were unable to store blood, in the midst of life-threatening medical emergencies, they were forced to recruit donors from those nearby. Sometimes the case histories are vague, referring merely, for example, to some gentleman present who undertook to supply a few ounces of blood. More frequently, however, we get a bit more detail. One large donor pool consists of the patient's close relatives, and case histories refer to fathers, sisters, and sons giving blood to dying patients. It is also not uncommon for attending physicians or medical students to supply blood. One proud physician recounts, "No sooner was the necessity of transfusion known to the pupils present than several of them volunteered the one thing required, the blood." Another physician recalls witnessing a transfusion at St. Thomas's Hospital in which, quote, blood was freely given by a number of the dressers, those are the hospital workers whose job it was to dress wounds, one or two of whom fainted in consequence of their generous gift and the heat of the small ward crowded with students. On one occasion, after a first donor is exhausted, the surgeon takes blood from his own nephew, quote, a healthy youth about 14 years of age, whom I had taken with me for the purpose, unquote. Many 19th century transfusions were performed in the patient's homes, and servants, including cooks, butlers, and gardeners, also appear as blood donors. One physician, after referring gratefully to the assistance rendered him by two fellow medical professionals who were in attendance, adds, "It would be ungrateful not to admit that a large part of the success of this operation is due to the coachman who acted as blood donor, and who was not only collected and cheerful, but able to make several useful suggestions during the process of transfusion." I'd like to place this new figure of the donor in the context of the surgery itself as it was practiced in the 19th century. The method of transfusion that James Blundell introduced and that his followers practiced would become known as mediate transfusion, in which the donor's blood was collected in a vessel and then injected into the recipient's vein. The equipment for mediate transfusion could be minimal, some kind of receptacle for gathering blood, and a syringe. And there you have a funnel and syringe designed specifically for mediate transfusion. Over the years, however, Practitioners exercised no little ingenuity in developing various devices designed to facilitate the operation. Blundell himself was an enthusiastic inventor of such medical machinery, introducing a device he named the impeller, and a bit later another device called the gravitator. I'm going to show you his. Okay, there is the impeller meant to be mounted on the side of a chair, and then here is a cross-section of the impeller, so you can see how complicated this machine was. Frustrated with such complex and ingenious machinery, which was prone to malfunction, a number of transfusionists championed an alternative technique known as immediate transfusion, in which the veins of the donor and recipient were connected by a much simplified apparatus, the blood flowing directly from one to the other. The most prominent advocate for immediate transfusion was J.H. Aveling, founder of the Sheffield Hospital for Women. The heart itself is, in Aveling's own words, the most perfect of all transfusion apparatuses. And in his transfusion mechanism, he attempted to replicate this perfect and perfectly simple apparatus. And here it is. Oh, that's the gravitator in action. Sorry, I skipped that one, so you can see that. And then here is Aveling's immediate transfusion. And you can see there's just this little pump in the middle, and then the arms are just directly connected by these tubes. In 1873, after having carried this apparatus about in his pocket for 8 years, Aveling was able to put his design to the test. Although only one of his first 2 cases ended in the patient's recovery, the mechanism itself performed perfectly satisfactorily. Aveling's energetic advocacy for his technique sparked a lively debate in the medical community. This controversy is not, however, simply a disagreement concerning the most effective medical technology. We can get a sense of what else is at stake in this debate by looking at 2 sketches published in medical journals of the techniques in use. Both represent what we might call the primal scene of 19th century transfusion, the injection of blood from a male donor into the veins of a female patient. In both, the operator himself is conspicuously absent. The only 2 people in this tableau are the donor and the recipient. And so again, I want to emphasize how the story of the development of transfusion complicates the traditional narrative of the consolidation and preservation of medical authority and power in the person of the physician. In this case, the physician seems to be absent. Okay, in the first sketch, I'm going to turn back to our gravitator in action. The donor stands, his right sleeve rolled up as if for manual labor. His arm with its prominent muscles is extended above the funnel of the transfusion apparatus in a gesture of physical strength and heroic self-sacrifice. He appears unaffected as his blood flows freely, even gracefully, into the machine. Compare this to the second sketch. This is J.H. Aveling's own sketch of his apparatus for immediate transfusion. No longer standing heroically, the donor is sitting on the floor next to the bed. The clumsy perspective makes him appear to be lower than the patient herself. Although he's clenching his fist, there's no articulation of the musculature in his arm. It's as smooth as the woman's. There's nothing that marks the male donor as active. On the contrary, we seem to witness the union of 2 passive bodies. Looking at these 2 sketches, we can see that what is most importantly mediated in immediate transfusion is the relationship between donor and recipient. The machine, the gravitator, the impeller, interposes itself between the 2 parties, enabling the flow of blood from one to the other only by first channeling this vital fluid through its own mechanism. Aveling's minimal apparatus would seem instead to forge a union between the 2 bodies. This union is not, however, a symbiotic one. As one half of this artificially created single organism benefits, the other loses. As Dr. Seward himself remarks in Dracula, the draining away of one's blood, no matter how willingly it be given, is a terrible feeling. As practitioners debated the merits of immediate transfusion, they focused their attention on the effect of the scene of trauma on the donors, especially on the patient's loved ones. Increasingly, the opponents of immediate transfusion emphasize its impact on the husband donors in particular. One critic of Aveling's proposal declares, quote, "The The person about to part with the blood, and who is generally the husband or some near relative, should not be brought to the bedside of the patient, whose alarming appearance at such a moment would inevitably produce the deepest anguish and agitation," unquote. The obstetrician J. Braxton Hicks, that name still lives on, Braxton Hicks contractions. J. Braxton Hicks writes in 1869, quote, "Where the husband has to be brought into the room, the flow of blood is often very slow. For be one as careful as one can, the whole scene is appalling to a man never used to such a sight, and conscious that his wife is in extreme jeopardy," unquote. In one unforgettable case in which the patient dies, the reporting physician writes the following: "The only chance of saving her life would have been by transfusion, but where was the blood donor to be found in this case? The husband was wandering about the room in the greatest alarm, pale as ashes. No man could have got a drop of blood from him," unquote. And this moment is, to me, more chilling than any of the effects in Dracula itself. Indeed, if James Blundell's Lancet lectures represent the idealized and sentimentalized narrative of transfusion with the images of fluttering hearts and fading tapers that he's used, the case histories provide something much more Gothic: the lurid spectacle of the drained and corpse-like body of the woman on the brink of the grave. The case histories describe blood, and these are all going to be phrases drawn from case histories themselves. They describe blood soaking through the bed upon the floor, patients found lying in a large pool of blood or found lying swamped in blood. The women who become the subjects of transfusion are, in the words of Charles Waller, a lecturer on midwifery at St. Thomas's Hospital, quote, "as near death as it is possible for anyone to be without being actually dead," unquote. And here are just a few of the physician's detailed descriptions of these patients. And again, I'm weaving together a number of case histories here. "When I entered the room, the patient was, to all external appearance, dead, lying on her back, completely blanched, her face pale as the sheet that covered her. She was found with a most death-like expression of countenance. Her extremities were of a marble coldness. I found her lying in a large pool of blood. The skin and extremities had become cold, and the surface of the body as white as snow, eyes sunken and leaden. Her countenance was blanched and cadaverous. Every now and then a cessation of the pulse, a livid hue of the face, and motionless position of the body marked a temporary loss of consciousness, which I more than once mistook for death." Now, faced with these graphic descriptions, we could say that transfusion does not so much prevent the deathbed scene as first require its performance in order to provide it with a sequel. Because of the controversial nature of the practice, physicians and surgeons waited until they believed that their patients were beyond all other chance of recovery before having recourse to transfusion. Thus, these women seem to be not so much healed as raised from the dead. In the words of one surgeon writing in 1857, quote, "The change was immediate. The color returned to her lips, the eyes became brilliant, the pulse distinct and firm, and she now looks, with the exception of her whitened skin, as well as ever I saw her," unquote. Another article describes the eerie moments when these dead awaken, quote, "Some have started up as from a long sleep and moved their limbs, asked for food. Others, even those who eventually recovered, have only slowly shown signs of returning life." The more disquieting possibilities of resurrection are hinted at in the following report. "The patient opened her eyes, the face reddened, and the heart palpitated strongly. A frothy saliva issued from the mouth, and the respiration became deep and rapid. Now this doctor leaves the room for a bit, and then on returning, he finds the patient with, quote, her eyes wide open, and an expression on her countenance as of one who had returned from the other world. On the 18th day, he reports, she was able to get up and forgot that she had been as one dead for upwards of a quarter of an hour. She is now the mother of a large family," unquote. The transition from the experience of death, the image of the woman with her eyes wide open, with an expression as of one who had returned from the other world, to the erasure of this experience, the insistence on her forgetfulness of it, is haunting in itself. It's as if Lazarus had no memory of having been in the tomb. The evocation of the sentimental here, the happy news that this woman is now the mother of a large family, seems partly to be an attempt to deny the Gothic possibilities of these scenes of near death and resurrection. What the literary critic John Allen Stevenson says of female victims in vampire narratives can also be said of these real women who inhabit the medical histories. They are, quote, human women who have become something very strange, who have been profoundly changed, unquote. In the case histories, this transformation into something strange and potentially horrifying can be undone or recuperated by the woman's inscription into the role of the angel in the house, the domestic idol of Victorian culture, the mother of a large family. Now, I would like to end by juxtaposing one of the 19th century case histories of transfusion with the literary text that initially inspired my interest in the subject, Dracula. In 1870, the Dublin Quarterly Journal of Medical Science published a dramatic account by Thomas E. Beatty, MD, former president of the King and Queen's College of Physicians in Ireland. Called to the bedside of a woman who has given birth prematurely, Beatty finds the patient, quote, pale, pulseless, and cold as marble, unquote. Attempts to revive her with stimulants fail. Quote, she became insensible, the countenance became ghastly, and the jaw dropped. All trace of pulse had long vanished, and death seemed very near at hand, unquote. Under these desperate circumstances, Beatty determines not to let her die without making the only effort that in his mind could save her, and that ultimate effort, of course, is the performance of an emergency blood transfusion. Quickly, Beatty and a colleague set to work. The patient's extreme blood loss makes it difficult to find a vein. We see that repeated over and over in the case histories. Quote, the patient was as a corpse, bloodless. There was no trace of a vein to be found, unquote. So the practitioner split open the skin of the woman's arm, quote, leaving a wide, gaping wound, which displayed the veins at the bottom, resembling small, flat, dead earthworms, unquote. They are now able to proceed with the transfusion using blood from the patient's husband. Beatty reports the results. It was intensely interesting to watch the effect produced by the introduction of this vital fluid. The countenance became less ghastly, and imminent death seemed warded off when the last portion of blood had been injected. In fact, this patient makes a full recovery. The practitioner called to the bedside of a woman close to death from the loss of blood, the insistence on the critical condition of the patient with a detailed description of the visible signs of impending death, and the ad hoc recruitment of a blood donor, the hasty performance of the operation, all of these details are repeated over and over in the numerous transfusion case histories that appeared in medical journals and in medical monographs, whether these cases ended in recovery or the death of the patient. And this is also, of course, the outline that Bram Stoker follows in Dracula in his representation of the 4 blood transfusions that Abraham Van Helsing performs on Lucy Westenra in what will prove a futile attempt to counteract the Count's attacks on her. In these harrowing scenes, Stoker adheres faithfully to the descriptions of transfusion available in the medical texts. In the case histories, however, the female patient's transformation into something strange and potentially horrifying can be undone by the happy ending, by restoring her to her maternal role. Think, for example, of the patient I referred to above. But if the productive female body can rehabilitate or erase the Gothic possibilities it has given rise to, the non-productive female body cannot offer this redemption. Dracula's victim, Lucy, does not give birth. But in her repeated depletions and transfusions, she's doomed to enact over and over again the trauma of a near-fatal labor, which, as the puzzled John Seward says, with no sign to show for it. Thus, while Lucy Westenra does not give birth to a child, by paying attention to the ways in which her case and the treatment she receives so closely mirror the 19th century case histories, we can see that the obstetric context of the operation is present, buried within the fictional narrative from which it would seem at first to be completely absent. What is being born in these scenes, as the victim in turn will drain her clueless donors, providing further meals for Dracula himself, what is being born in these scenes is Lucy's own new identity as a vampire. Thank you.
student questions and then transition to the rest of the audience.
Hi, sorry, that was loud. I was wondering, is there anything in the case history about a woman donating blood to a man or even to another woman?
That's a great question. And yeah, I'll take the second part first, women into women. So a lot of these cases are obstetric cases, and so you don't have male patients, but not all of them are fit that model. But you do have women, sisters, in-laws donating blood to women who are in obstetric trauma. And then from time to time, they do branch out from the obstetric scene and attempt transfusion for other kinds of conditions. We're hoping that transfusion would cure cholera, actually. And so then you do get some male patients. Now, in that case, I think that I can remember perhaps one instance of a woman donating blood to a male recipient. But certainly women donating to women is more common.
First, I want to commend your lack of squeamishness.
Oh, well, it's taken me a long time.
I was wondering if you had any idea about Bram Stoker's medical history before he wrote Dracula. Was he a doctor beforehand?
No, that's another great question. He himself was not a physician, but his brother, William Thornley, was a very esteemed Irish physician. And William Thornley, Stoker, did consult with him on the transfusion episodes. And in the original typescript of Dracula, you can see William Thornley's notes in the margin about the operation itself, just sort of helping him along with the medical details. So it was in the family.
I was just curious because you mentioned the one French guy that made everyone stop doing the transfusions was actually poisoned by arsenic. Mm-hmm. Were there other cases that compounded the issue? Like there were other interspecies things where they realized it wasn't working out, or was it really just the one case?
It was that one particular case. It became like the equivalent of a tabloid case at the time. It generated a lot of publicity, a lot of anxiety, and people who were squeamish or unsettled by the idea of transfusion in general really leapt on that case. Now we're people are lucky they did leap on that case. I mean, people hadn't died yet from animal blood being transfused, but they certainly would eventually. That would have happened. But to follow up in the 19th century context, now Blundell himself, when he reintroduces transfusion to the British medical community, he rejects interspecies transfusion. And most of his British followers really also correspond to that. They don't branch out into interspecies transfusion. But it still remains, late into the 19th century, a subject for some debate. Well, why don't we use animal blood? And some physicians would say, well, it's just the same as food. It's just nutriment. It's just the same as the idea of intravenous feeding. So animal blood would be no problem whatsoever. And finally, after I've worked on this project for a number of years, reading these things, and finally, toward the end of all of my research, I did find one case of 19th century animal transfusion in Great Britain. J.H. Aveling, this very esteemed obstetrician, he wants to try this, and he waits to have a patient dying in the hospital, and he and another physician bring a lamb in, and they transfuse lamb's blood into that patient. She dies. With these cases, it's very difficult ever to know what the real cause of death is. But that certainly could have been the cause of death. But that's the one 19th century case that I could find in Great Britain. On the continent, they're still performing animal-to-human transfusions. I mean, not now. I mean, in the 19th century. They're still performing. No, don't get sick in Germany. No, that's not.
I was just wondering if you knew if there's any sort of criteria or screening done for donors, or could just anyone donate if they're sick before, or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question too. There's no understanding that human blood could be incompatible with other human blood. So there's no blood typing until the beginning of the 20th century. So that's off the table. But the question about disease is a really important one. They really can't test for what we know as blood-borne diseases. What you do see every once in a while is a husband refusing to donate blood to his wife, and in that case, a lot of times you can assume he has syphilis. And doctors will mention that, or they will ask people a little bit about their medical histories. But it's just this kind of unwritten kind of thing.
Hi, I'm just curious about the immediate transfusion. How quickly did they transfer the blood? Because wasn't there great risk of like blood clots?
Yeah, and blood clotting is a big problem for 19th century transfusion. And they developed, especially before immediate transfusion, they developed a technique they called defibrillation, where they would just whip the blood a lot and try to get as much clotting agent as they understood it out of the blood, and then use that defibrinated blood. You may notice in Dracula, Stoker does mention defibrillation, and it's not just him making up that term, it's a real medical term. But no, I mean, and these, it's so difficult to know the real efficacy of any of these operations. Certainly patients recovered. Whether they got enough blood into them to have that happen, or whether they would have recovered anyway, we really can't tell. But clotting was a big issue. And in the machines as well. I mean, that they were always gumming up, and people would just stop and take them apart, and that would be the end of that.
The British fought a lot of wars in the 19th century. Did any of their army doctors do transfusions after battles?
No, but you're exactly right, and they begin to talk about it. They don't start until World War I. World War I is really the huge moment of shifting transfusion into a real viable medical procedure, and the war inspires all of that work. There a little bit in the Crimean War. There's a little discussion every once in a while. Wouldn't it be great if we had transfusion? Might that not work? But they don't have any way, really, because of blood storage. I mean, you need a bunch of things to make all of this come together. But one of the main things you need is a way to store blood. And if you're working with already the wounded, do you want to use your healthy soldiers as blood donors? Maybe not. So it doesn't start until World War I. But there is talk, you're absolutely right, there's talk about it.
Is there any indication of an Eastern tradition for doing blood transfusion, or did this really just come out of the West?
Right. I've confined myself trying to be very disciplined about it because there's so much of this material to work with. I've confined myself absolutely to Great Britain. And certainly within that tradition, there's no reference to any other tradition influencing it. But I do know just from casual reading that there certainly is discussion of other cultures, even the Incan culture perhaps, engaging in some kind of blood work in this way. But I didn't go there. And I also didn't pay attention to the American context because I think that would be a whole other world to take on.
Why was there such a fixation in the medical profession on bloodletting?
Yeah, I mean, it seems completely counterintuitive, but it goes back to the Galenic ideas of the humors. It's that old. It's based on this classical model of the four humors in the body that need to be in balance. And a primary one of those is the blood itself. And so Galen had this whole theory of how by strategically bleeding people from different parts of their bodies, you could cure all kinds of physical and mental ailments, and that it just hung on. And really, we're talking about the mid-19th century. People are still committed to this as a primary surgical intervention. Even as Marshall Hall said, even they're watching people die left and right. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes, yes. Not just the British, no.
Well, Janine, do you have a question? Oh, okay. Any more questions? Well, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful lecture. We
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And,